I'd like to clarify right off the bat, because I was curious about this, as well as maybe some of our viewers might be. Is it Islam itself as a religion that you take issue with, or is it the extremist interpretation of Islam?
Actually, neither. What I really take issue with is the silent moderates within Islam. It's a no-brainer to fight against the extremism. Anybody can do that. And no, Islam itself is not the problem. I believe that it has the raw materials to be humane and thoughtful and reasonable, as it has been for hundreds of years. It is so-called moderates within the faith of Islam who are abandoning their responsibility to speak up against the abuse of power that is happening in the name of our religion today. And let me make a distinction, if I may, between moderate Muslims and reform-minded Muslims, of which I am one. Moderate Muslims, sure, they denounce the violence being committed under the banner of Islam, but they deny that religion plays any role in that violence. Reform-minded Muslims, on the other hand, also condemn violence committed in the name of Islam, but we acknowledge that our religion is being used. And notice that I said used. Of course it's manipulated. Islam is being exploited, but that is no reason to deny the role of religion. And when we, as reasonable Muslims, say that Islam has nothing to do with this violence, what we're in effect doing is abandoning the ground of theological interpretation to those who do abuse power. We are saying to them, you guys get to run away with what Islam is, because we're not going to come back at you with bold and competing reinterpretations. And we can't do that, because if we did, well then we would be acknowledging that religion plays a role. See, this is the problem with the moderates. Reform-minded Muslims, on the other hand, say, look, we have to snap out of denial. We have to acknowledge that violent verses do exist in our scripture, just as they do in the Bible, just as they do in the Torah. And like liberal Christians and liberal Jews, we have got to reinterpret those violent verses, take them out of a 7th century tribal context and put them in a 21st century pluralistic context. And for those who say that is un-Islamic, you are rewriting the Quran. No, we are rethinking words that already exist. And the Quran itself tells us that we must analyze, we must reflect, we must think. In fact, there are 3 times as many verses telling us this than there are verses that tell us what is absolutely forbidden or acceptable. So in that sense, reform-minded Muslims are at least as authentic as mainstream Muslims, and quite possibly more constructive.
Which brings up the question of Ijtihad.
Yes.
And your project, Ijtihad, that you are campaigning for. And can you tell us a little bit about that and what motivated you for that?
Sure. Ijtihad is Islam's own tradition of critical thinking, independent reasoning, debate, and dissent. And far from being mere theory, this tradition has a track record. In the early centuries of Islam, thanks to the spirit of Ijtihad, 135 schools of interpretation flourished. In Muslim Spain, scholars would teach their students to abandon, quote, expert opinion about the Quran if their own conversations with the very ambiguous Quran, the fluid, living, breathing Quran, came up with better evidence for their ideas. And among the more sophisticated cities of Muslim Spain, there were 70 libraries. Now, that rivals the number of libraries in most cosmopolitan cities today. Well, Islam had this 1,000 years ago. And we Ijtihadists are pointing out to our fellow Muslims that there is no heresy, no blasphemy in calling for a revival of Ijtihad. Quite the opposite. When we engage in critical thinking, we are actually living up to the best spirit of the Quran. We are rediscovering our own better angels within Islam. And as I say in my book, the time for that kind of a reformation is now. Never has it been more necessary.
As you have mentioned and emphasized, you're not asking to rewrite.
No.
You're asking to interpret as was interpreted years before, as you mentioned in your film as well, with the Andalusia and the whole concept of thinking in a democratic way.
Right.
Thinking, coming together and having a democratic solution to these problems.
Yes, and by democratic, let's remember that also means women must be a major part of the world in Islam that is now engaged with ideas. And in my book, I point out that there is a global campaign that can be launched in order to liberate the power of women to think and analyze the Quran for themselves. And I call this Operation Ijtihad. This would begin by freeing up the entrepreneurial talents of women in the Islamic world through microcredit loans. When they accept these loans and start their own businesses, what they can do is earn their own money. And in Islam, there is consensus that when a woman earns her own money, she gets to keep 100% of that assets and do with it as she sees fit. Now, what could women do with the assets that they earn? For starters, they could become literate, learn to read the Quran for themselves, see all of the verses that it offers them for empowerment, for dignity, respect, many of which, by the way, mullahs will never tell them about for obvious reasons. And beyond that, these women can start their own schools. And this is happening in just some precious parts of Kabul today, where women who have accepted microcredit loans are starting their own schools. And in some of these schools, you can read signs that say, educate a boy, and you educate only that boy, but educate a girl, and you educate her entire family. In other words, the multiplier effect of investing in Muslim women cannot be underestimated. The whole point of this is, in fact, to ensure that women know it is their God-given right to think for themselves and to interpret the Quran for themselves and develop a personal relationship with Allah. And I believe, as so many Muslim women are coming to believe around the world, that we are the ones, as women, who are going to lead the charge to restore humanity and reason to Islam. But in order to do that, we first have to put the male conservative imams and theologians on notice that they no longer own Islam as if it was their property. It is God's property, and as human beings, as His creatures on earth, we are here to engage in these ideas, according to what the Quran tells us. And the Quran tells us at the end of the day that we are all, as human beings, equal in the eyes of God. That it is not the gender with which we are born that defines our piety, but it is our actions. And part of that action is to think.
A very important point. And it brings to mind the Grameen Bank that does these microloans. Women in Bangladesh, I believe, who have become very empowered through this program.
Well, indeed, and that's one of the great, virtues of pursuing a microcredit plan is that, again, like Ijtihad, it's not mere theory. It has a concrete history behind it. The 30-plus year track record of the microcredit movement shows that when Muslim women accept these loans, they are used not just to better their quality of life as individuals, but to improve the lives of their families, entire neighborhoods, sometimes even whole villages. And something else must be pointed out too, that the beauty of this idea is that it is eminently compatible with Islam as a religion. It doesn't have to be a secular idea. It is not merely about economic development. It is also, again, about emulating the best of the Prophet Muhammad's life. For example, the Prophet Muhammad's beloved first wife, Khadija, was a wealthy, self-made businesswoman for whom the Prophet worked for many, many years. She was his boss. And a lot of Muslim women who decide to accept microcredit loans are saying to their husbands, if you want to imitate the Prophet Muhammad's life, don't just grow a beard. Okay, that's very superficial. The deeper way of emulating his life is to allow me, as your wife, to work for myself, because this is what Khadija did too. So it's a very compelling argument that, again, brings out the best of what Islam is about. Notice that this isn't about changing Islam. It's about changing Muslims to respect the best spirit of Islam.